The steel beasts rolled across the frozen steppes like iron gods, their treads carving deep scars into the earth as columns of exhaust painted the winter sky. Thousands of T-72s and T-80s stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, a mechanical wall that Soviet commanders believed was utterly impenetrable. In the briefing rooms of Moscow, generals gestured at maps with supreme confidence, their voices carrying the weight of absolute certainty that no Western force could stand against this armored tide. The Cold War had become a chess game played with tanks, and the Soviet Union was convinced it held every winning piece. NATO forces across the Iron Curtain were dismissed as technologically inferior, their equipment outdated, their doctrine weak. This wasn't mere propaganda spoken for political theatre, but genuine belief forged through decades of military development and combat experience. The red star emblazoned on every turret wasn't just a symbol, it was a promise of inevitable victory. Colonel Dmitry Volkov stood before a scale model of a T-80, his weathered hands tracing the familiar angles of its armor as junior officers gathered around with notebooks open and pens ready. The tank represented 15 years of Soviet engineering supremacy, a machine that had evolved from the brutal lessons of the Great Patriotic War into something the West could never hope to match. Intelligence photographs littered the briefing table, grainy images of NATO exercises showing their aging patterns and early model Leopards struggling through maneuvers. Volkov's voice carried the gravitas of a man who had spent his entire life preparing for the war that everyone knew was coming, but prayed would never arrive. His words painted a picture of overwhelming superiority, of Soviet steel that could punch through any armor NATO possessed, of crews trained to a razor's edge of lethality. The younger officers absorbed every word like gospel, their faces reflecting the absolute confidence that radiated from their commander. Outside the briefing room, the rumble of tank engines provided a constant reminder of the power backing up those confident words. The production facilities worked around the clock, their foundries glowing like captured stars as they poured out tank after tank to feed the insatiable appetite of Soviet military doctrine. Every new T-72 rolling off the assembly line reinforced the narrative that Moscow had achieved something the West could never counter, a perfect balance of firepower, protection, and mobility. The doctrine was clear and had been tested in countless exercises across Eastern Europe, rapid assault formations that would smash through any defensive line before NATO could effectively respond. Military journals published articles celebrating Soviet armored superiority, their pages filled with technical specifications that seemed to prove beyond doubt the supremacy of socialist engineering. Defense ministers from Warsaw-packed nations visited tank bases and returned home with stories of invincible steel legions. The confidence wasn't limited to the officer corps. It permeated every level of Soviet society, from factory workers building the machines to conscripts learning to crew them. In this moment of the late Cold War, the Soviet Union stood atop what it believed was an unassailable mountain of military might, never imagining that across the Atlantic a storm of innovation was about to shatter that illusion forever. The answer emerged not from Moscow's sprawling tank factories, but from the industrial heartland of America, where designers at Chrysler Defense hunched over drafting tables that would redefine armored warfare. The project began in the mid-70s, born from a sobering recognition that Soviet tank development had leaped ahead, while American armor languished with designs rooted in Vietnam-era thinking. Engineers worked in climate-controlled facilities that hummed with the quiet intensity of men who understood they were building more than a machine. They were forging the steel backbone of Western defense. The specifications seemed almost fantastical at first. A turbine engine borrowed from aircraft technology, composite armor that blended ceramics and depleted uranium into layers that could shatter kinetic penetrators, and fire control systems that married laser rangefinders with ballistic computers of unprecedented sophistication. Defense contractors argued in Pentagon conference rooms about weight, ratios, and fuel consumption, while Soviet intelligence officers dismissed the entire project as typical American excess. The Abrams, as it came to be called, represented a fundamental shift in philosophy, moving away from the Soviet doctrine of overwhelming numbers toward a precision instrument designed to kill at distances previously thought impossible. Test ranges in the Mojave Desert became theaters of transformation where the first prototypes roared across sand and rock, their turbine engines producing a distinctive whine that sounded nothing like traditional tank warfare. Crews selected for evaluation struggled initially with systems so advanced they seemed alien, digital displays, replacing analog gauges, thermal sights revealing enemy positions through darkness and smoke like witchcraft. The composite armor plates arrived at proving grounds wrapped in security classifications that kept even friendly eyes from understanding their true composition, each layer representing breakthroughs in material science that had cost millions in research. Gunnery trials produced results that made observers check their instruments twice. First-round hits at ranges where Soviet doctrine assumed tanks would be firing blindly through estimation and prayer. The turbine engine, initially mocked for its fuel consumption, demonstrated the ability to accelerate the 60-ton beast with a responsiveness that left diesel-powered contemporaries struggling in its dust. Word filtered back to design teams through encrypted channels, cautious optimism growing into genuine excitement as every test revealed capabilities exceeding even optimistic projections. Soviet intelligence networks tracked the development with growing files of technical reports and satellite imagery showing Abrams' production facilities expanding across the American industrial landscape. Analysts in Moscow pored over stolen specifications and defector testimonies, constructing assessments that consistently underestimated what American engineers had actually achieved behind their walls of classification and misdirection. The reports traveling up the Soviet chain of command painted the Abrams as overhyped, another example of Western propaganda inflating capabilities to justify bloated defense budgets and maintain the fiction of competitive parity. Photographs showed the distinctive angular turret and low profile, but intelligence officers convinced themselves these were cosmetic improvements, masking fundamental weaknesses in design philosophy. The turbine engine became a particular point of dismissal, Soviet experts citing fuel logistics and maintenance complications as fatal flaws that would cripple the machine in sustained combat operations. This willful underestimation reflected a deeper institutional arrogance, a belief system so invested in Soviet superiority that contradictory evidence was automatically filtered through lenses of skepticism and dismissal. By the early 80s, Abrams tanks began rolling off production lines in Lima, Ohio, their presence transforming American armored divisions stationed across Western Europe into something fundamentally different from what had existed before. NATO exercises took on new characteristics as American crews learned to exploit capabilities that redefined the geometry of tank warfare, engaging targets at distances that made previous doctrine obsolete. The machines arrived in Germany aboard massive transport ships, their deployment tracked by Soviet reconnaissance with reports that continued to minimize their significance even as the technological gap widened into a chasm. Warsaw Pact commanders updated their war plans based on intelligence assessments that bore increasingly little resemblance to reality, preparing their forces to fight an enemy they no longer truly understood. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would shatter illusions carefully maintained through decades of Cold War posturing, though none yet realized how completely the balance had shifted. The briefing room in the East German garrison smelled of diesel fumes and stale cigarette smoke, concrete walls decorated with faded propaganda posters showing Soviet tanks crushing fascist symbols beneath their treads. Senior Lieutenant Dmitry Volkov stood before his crew with a manila folder containing intelligence photographs of the American M1 Abrams, images grainy enough that the tank's angular features seemed almost abstract in the harsh fluorescent lighting. His men sat on wooden benches worn smooth by generations of soldiers, their faces displaying the casual confidence of tankers who had grown up believing Soviet armor was untouchable, invincible, the steel fist of a superpower that had never lost faith in its military supremacy. Volkov tapped the photographs with nicotine-stained fingers, describing the American machine with the dismissive tone reserved for enemy equipment that intelligence had already declared inferior before any shots were ever fired. The turbine engine drew particular mockery from his gunner, a stocky Ukrainian named Petrov, who laughed about fuel consumption rates that would leave American tanks stranded halfway through any sustained offensive. Outside, their T-72 sat in the motor pool, familiar and reliable, a machine they trusted with the intimacy of men whose lives depended on understanding every rivet and weld. Training exercises that autumn carried a new edge of urgency as NATO forces conducted their own maneuvers just kilometers away across the border, the sound of distant artillery rumbling through morning mist like thunder preceding an inevitable storm. Volkov's crew practiced engagement drills against range targets marked with Abrams silhouettes, their 125mm gun barking across muddy fields as they executed the rapid-fire doctrine that Soviet tankers had perfected through countless repetitions. The composite armor became a running joke during cigarette breaks, Petrov insisting that proper Soviet steel penetrators would slice through American ceramics like butter, that Western softness extended even to their tank construction. Intelligence officers visited the base periodically with updated briefings that reinforced these beliefs, showing ammunition test results that supposedly proved Soviet superiority in penetration and lethality. None of them had seen the actual American armor under laboratory conditions. None had witnessed what those classified layers could actually withstand when kinetic energy met material science that had leapt generations ahead. The confidence in their voices carried no shadow of doubt, no whisper of the terrible revelation that awaited them beyond the horizon. They were believers in a faith that reality had not yet tested, soldiers preparing for a war they thought they understood completely. The spring of 1983 arrived with frost still clinging to birch branches when NATO launched Autumn Forge, a military exercise so massive it stretched from the North Sea to the Austrian border, involving over 100,000 troops whose movements shook the earth like a mechanical earthquake. Volkov's regiment received alert orders at 0300 hours, sirens wailing through barracks as men stumbled from sleep into organized chaos. The practiced choreography of mobilization transforming quiet garrison life into wartime readiness within minutes. Across the wire, American and West German forces moved into forward positions with provocative boldness, their radio transmissions crackling through Soviet monitoring stations with codes and coordinates that intelligence analysts scrambled to interpret. The border itself seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Observation posts on both sides, watching through binoculars and thermal optics as armor columns moved into staging areas that war planners had designated years earlier. Volkov's crew slept beside their T-72 that night, wrapped in greatcoats that smelled of mothballs and old sweat, listening to the distant growl of Western tanks testing their engines in deliberate displays of strength. The political officers spoke of American aggression, of imperialism probing Soviet defenses for weakness, their words designed to transform nervousness into righteous anger. Every man understood that Miscalculation measured in meters or minutes could ignite the conflict that humanity had feared since Hiroshima's mushroom cloud first poisoned the sky. Warsaw Pact headquarters responded with Zapad 83, flooding the border zones with Soviet divisions that moved like iron rivers through East German villages, where civilians watched from darkened windows with ancient fear. The exercises became a chess game, played with tanks and artillery, each side maneuvering within strictly defined corridors while maintaining weapons lock readiness that kept fingers hovering near triggers. Volkov participated in night movements that turned forests into nightmares of diesel exhaust and clanking treads. His thermal sight showing green phantoms of friendly vehicles, while searching for theoretical enemies lurking beyond engagement range. American reconnaissance aircraft violated airspace with arrogant frequency, their contrails cutting white scars across autumn skies, while Soviet interceptors scrambled to meet provocations that stopped just short of actual combat. The tension became physical, a weight pressing against chests during every patrol, transforming routine operations into exercises in controlled terror, where professionalism barely contained the trembling knowledge of nuclear proximity. Headquarters distributed updated target packages, identifying enemy formations with clinical precision, reducing human beings to grid coordinates and equipment designations. War had never felt closer than those weeks when spring mud and political miscalculation separated peace from apocalypse by margins too thin to measure. During the quiet hours between exercises, Commander Petrov gathered his crew in the tank park where maintenance crews worked under flickering sodium lights that cast long shadows across armor plating still warm from the day's maneuvers. He carried a worn folder stamped with red classification markings, documents that Intelligence Directorate had distributed to officer ranks, with instructions for selective disclosure to enlisted men. The papers contained technical assessments of the American Abrams, compiled by analysts in Moscow who had never touched a tank but wielded mathematics and ideology like weapons capable of defeating Western technology through sheer dialectical certainty. Volkov and his companions sat on ammunition crates while Petrov read aloud passages describing the turbine engine as mechanically unsound, fuel-hungry beyond practical limits, a capitalist indulgence that prioritized corporate profits over battlefield effectiveness. The words came wrapped in scientific language that made speculation sound like proven fact, each paragraph reinforcing the comfortable belief that Soviet engineering remained superior despite Western propaganda claims. Around them, other crews gathered in similar clusters, receiving identical briefings that transformed uncertainty into confidence, through the alchemy of institutional authority, speaking with unwavering conviction. The intelligence reports detailed supposed maintenance nightmares plaguing American armored units, stories of turbines requiring replacement after minimal operating hours, while spare parts shortages crippled readiness rates below acceptable standards. Petrov spoke of composite armor that shattered under temperature extremes, of fire control systems too delicate for actual combat conditions, of crews inadequately trained to exploit their equipment's theoretical capabilities. These assessments came from sources the briefing materials never quite specified, circling vaguely around defectors and technical espionage without providing verifiable details that might invite skepticism. Volkov wanted to believe every word, because doubt meant acknowledging that the tank protecting his life might prove inadequate against enemies he could encounter tomorrow or next week. His loader, young Dmitry from a Ukrainian village whose name sounded like wind through wheat fields, asked whether American crews possessed the fighting spirit necessary for actual combat, rather than parade ground demonstrations. Petrov smiled with paternal certainty, explaining that Western soldiers were soft, accustomed to comfort, incapable of the sacrifices that Soviet men accepted as natural duty. The briefing concluded with reassurances wrapped in statistics showing Soviet numerical superiority, production capacity, tactical doctrine refined through decades of theoretical study and historical analysis, stretching back to Kursk. Petrov closed the folder with deliberate finality, a gesture meant to seal conclusions beyond further questioning, transforming complex technological reality into simple certainties that soldiers required before facing potential death. They returned to their bunks, carrying the comfortable weight of manufactured confidence, sleeping, easier for believing that expertise beyond their understanding had measured the enemy and found him wanting. Outside, guards paced perimeters where floodlights created artificial daylight against darkness that concealed watchtowers on the western side, mirrors of their own positions across barriers dividing certainty from the unknown. The incident began not with declarations or formal communications, but with silence, where radio chatter should have existed, a void in electromagnetic spectrum that monitoring stations detected like absence of pulse in living tissue. Along a forest corridor in Thuringia, where patrol routes approached within dangerous proximity, an American reconnaissance vehicle failed to report scheduled position updates, while Soviet border guards observed movement patterns deviating from established norms that governed the careful choreography, preventing accidental war. Commanders on both sides faced decisions compressed into minutes rather than hours, operating under protocols designed by distant planners who imagined clarity where only fog existed. The Americans claimed navigational error, their vehicles withdrawing slowly while maintaining defensive postures that suggested either genuine mistake or probe testing response times. Soviet officers saw provocation or preparation pattern matching against threat assessments warning of surprise attack. Disguised as accident, within hours, units along 50 kilometers of frontier received alerts elevating readiness conditions, transforming routine deployment into combat preparation through administrative language that made catastrophe sound procedural. Volkov's crew learned of the situation when whistles pierced pre-dawn darkness. Non-commissioned officers moving through barracks with urgency that bypassed normal wake-up routines and morning rituals. They dressed in blackness broken only by red flashlights preserving night vision, fumbling with equipment whose locations they knew through muscle memory developed across countless repetitions. The tank park erupted into controlled chaos as engines roared to life, commanders shouting coordinates, while mechanics performed final checks on systems that might mean survival measured in milliseconds. Nobody spoke the word war, but its possibility hung in diesel exhaust and ozone smell of electrical systems, powering weapons designed exclusively for killing. Petrov's face showed strain around eyes and mouth, tension communicating what official statements left unspoken. They rolled toward assembly positions through forests where dawn filtered through pine branches, creating cathedral light that seemed absurdly beautiful against their purpose. Radio traffic filled their headsets with coded directions and situation. Updates stripped of context, fragments describing American armor movements and helicopter activity, suggesting escalation beyond mere posturing. Intelligence assessments from earlier briefings now face practical testing, comfortable certainties meeting reality in contested ground where mistakes became casualties. Volkov checked his sights. Repeatedly, mechanical ritual providing illusion of control while understanding that decisions made in capitals far removed would determine whether he fired these weapons at human targets. Around them, the entire regiment deployed into attack formations, spreading across terrain they had studied on maps but never expected to contest with live ammunition. The buffer zone ahead represented more than geographical boundary. It marked the edge between peace and whatever came after. Threshold they approached with mixture of training-induced confidence and animal fear that no ideology could completely suppress. They halted in concealed positions where camouflage netting broke their silhouettes, against tree lines, waiting for orders that would either stand them down or commit them to engagement. Through his optics, Volkov scanned distant ridgelines where American forces presumably occupied mirror positions. Two armies watching each other across space, measured in kilometers, but separated by technological mysteries, neither side fully comprehended. The morning stretched into afternoon, with tension that exhausted more thoroughly than physical labor, every nerve ending alert for movement or radio transmission that might signal beginning or end. Petrov chain-smoked cigarettes cupped in his palm, old soldier habit from conflicts these younger men knew only through stories, each exhalation carrying prayers to gods that socialist doctrine claimed didn't exist, but desperate men always remembered. The order came through encrypted channels with clinical brevity that transformed waiting into action, coordinates transmitted in numeric sequences that plotting officers converted into firing solutions with hands steadier than their voices. Volkov felt his heart accelerate as Petrov confirmed the engagement directive, words that seemed too casual for their weight, settling into the crew compartment like physical presence. Through his optical sight, he identified targets at maximum effective range, distant shapes that thermal imaging rendered as bright signatures against cooler landscape, machines containing men whose faces he would never see, but whose destruction he was now authorized to accomplish. The T-72's gun traversed with hydraulic precision, crosshairs settling on the lead vehicle in a formation that moved with confidence, suggesting ignorance of danger waiting across the contested ground. His hand rested on controls that bridged intention and consequence, years of training compressed into this moment where doctrine met reality and theory became smoke and thunder. Petrov's command to fire arrived simultaneously with reports from adjacent units engaging their own targets, creating rippling crescendo of cannon reports that echoed through valleys like approaching storm. Volkov pressed the firing mechanism, feeling the familiar violent recoil that rocked their hull, despite suspension designed to absorb such forces, watching the tracer element in their sabot-round arc toward impact point, calculated by ballistic computers and human experience. Around them, the regiment's first salvo reached, downrange in ragged sequence, expectations built on decades of supremacy doctrine, anticipating the devastating effectiveness they had demonstrated in countless exercises against surrogate targets and obsolete equipment. Through smoke clearing from their muzzle brake, Volkov tracked his round's trajectory toward the American tank, mined already. Processing the reload sequence while expecting confirmation of penetration that would validate everything their training promised about Soviet armament superiority and Western vulnerability. The impact produced visible flash against the target's frontal aspect, expected signature of kinetic energy meeting resistance, but the American tank continued movement without deviation, suggesting catastrophic damage or crew incapacitation. Volkov's certainty wavered as he observed the target rotate its turret with mechanical smoothness, indicating intact systems and operational capacity, impossibility that contradicted doctrine and experience simultaneously. Radio channels filled with confused reports from other crews describing similar failures. Rounds that should have penetrated instead, producing only surface effects against armor that absorbed impacts through means their intelligence assessments had dismissed as Western exaggeration. The Americans began returning fire with deliberate precision, their response carrying quality of technical superiority that transformed confidence into first, cold fingers of fear, reaching through combat conditioning. The crew watched, in suspended disbelief as friendly units began reporting catastrophic hits. Soviet armor penetrated at ranges exceeding their own effective engagement distances by margins that suggested fundamental miscalculation in capability assessment. Volkov loaded another round, with hands moving through mechanical memory, while his mind struggled processing information that invalidated comfortable assumptions about technological parity and battlefield superiority. Petrov's voice carried new edge when ordering target reacquisition, uncertainty bleeding. through command authority as the engagement's reality diverged from predicted outcomes with implications extending beyond this single contested morning. They fired again into chaos that swallowed certainties, each shot now carrying desperation rather than confidence, prayers rather than expectations. The second round struck with identical futility, their supposedly unstoppable sabot ammunition deflecting off composite layers that Soviet metallurgists had assured command could not exist in functional form. Through his gunner's scope, Volkov witnessed the impossible made manifest as American tanks advanced through their barrage like armored ghosts immune to conventional physics, each failed penetration, eroding the certainty that had sustained him through years of ideological conditioning and technical training. Around their position, the regiment's formation began fragmenting as crews independently recognized the futility of frontal engagement, some attempting flanking maneuvers while others accelerated into desperate charges. That doctrine never contemplated because doctrine assumed parity at minimum and superiority as birthright. The radio frequencies collapsed into overlapping transmissions of damage reports and final messages, voices carrying disbelief that transformed into terror as understanding dawned that they were technologically outmatched by margins rendering courage and training merely preliminary to inevitable destruction. Their third shot went wide as Petrov ordered emergency repositioning, the commander's voice stripped of its characteristic authority and reduced to survival instinct, overriding tactical consideration. Volkov felt the T-72 lurch into reverse as their driver responded without awaiting complete instruction, tracks churning earth in maneuver that abandoned their prepared position for uncertain protection of terrain defilade. Through fragmentary vision between reloading and movement, he witnessed a neighboring tank erupt in catastrophic secondary explosion, its ammunition cooking off in fireball that painted the morning sky with black smoke and burning propellant creating funeral pyre visible for kilometers. The American gun systems fired with mechanical precision, suggesting computer-assisted targeting beyond Soviet developmental timelines, each shot finding vulnerable points with efficiency that seemed less like combat than systematic demolition of obstacles. Impeding predetermined advance, they reached minimal cover behind a ridgeline as another friendly unit disintegrated under impacts that penetrated frontal armor, turret roof, and side skirts with equal dismissive ease. Volkov's hands trembled, loading what he recognized might be their final round, muscle memory persisting even as rational thought acknowledged the mathematical certainty of their tactical position. Petrov maintained communication discipline, reporting their status and requesting instruction from battalion command that responded with silence, suggesting command structure itself had fragmented under engagement pressures, exceeding all preparation and contingency planning. The Abrams appeared on their flank with predatory patience, its turret traversing toward their position with smooth mechanical movement that seemed unhurried because it faced no meaningful threat from their presence. Volkov centered his crosshairs, knowing the angle offered no vulnerability, finger poised over firing mechanism, not from hope but from refusal to die passive. The American fired first, and the world became concussive force that ended questions with terminal clarity, their final moment recognizing supremacy they never believed possible until it arrived wearing desert camouflage and turbine engine hum. The silence that followed the engagement hung over the battle space like radiation from an invisible detonation, pervasive and contaminating everything it touched with newfound understanding. Soviet crews emerged from surviving vehicles, moving with the mechanical uncertainty of men whose fundamental assumptions about reality had been systematically dismantled by empirical demonstration, their faces carrying expressions that transcended simple defeat to approach existential horror. Colonel Dmitry Reznikov stood amid the smoking wreckage of his battalion, counting losses that represented not merely destroyed equipment, but shattered doctrine, each burned-out hull a monument to technological overconfidence, cultivated through decades of carefully managed intelligence, reports, and ideological reassurance. The morning sun illuminated a field scattered with evidence of miscalculation so profound that blame seemed almost philosophical rather than tactical, responsibility dispersing into systemic failure, encompassing metallurgists and strategists and political officers who had promised parity while reality prepared. This brutal correction. The American formation had withdrawn after achieving their objective with efficiency, suggesting this represented routine procedure rather than desperate victory, their departure almost casual in its confidence. Reznikov walked between destroyed tanks, cataloguing damage patterns that told stories his training never prepared him to read. Penetrations so clean they appeared surgical rather than combative, armor compromised with precision, indicating fire control systems generations beyond Soviet capabilities. His radio operator reported casualty figures in monotone, suggesting emotional shutdown, numbers accumulating into statistics that would require explanation, ascending through command structures until reaching levels where strategic implications outweighed tactical details. The surviving crew members avoided eye contact with each other, sharing unspoken recognition that their previous certainty about Soviet technological supremacy had been comfortable fiction maintained only through absence of contradictory evidence that this morning had provided in overwhelming abundance. Recovery vehicles arrived from rear echelon positions, their crews working with grim determination to salvage what intelligence could be extracted from the wreckage before NATO reconnaissance confirmed the extent of Soviet vulnerability. Reznikov observed technicians examining penetration angles and armor failures with the focused intensity of coroners, determining cause of death. Their findings preliminary to reports that would cascade through military and political hierarchies. The composite armor fragments and sabot rounds that had failed so completely would become evidence in analyses attempting to quantify the technological gap that doctrine had dismissed as Western propaganda, but combat had validated as operational reality. He understood intuitively that this engagement represented microcosm of larger truth, that Soviet confidence had rested on assumptions about Western capabilities deliberately underestimated to maintain ideological narratives now exposed as dangerously inadequate. The wind carried smoke across the battlefield as Reznikov composed his after-action report, each sentence a small surrender to truth that decades of certainty had obscured until revelation arrived, wearing American insignia and turbine engines. The reports ascending through Soviet military hierarchies carried implications extending far beyond tactical defeat, each forwarded document accumulating weight as it traveled from battlefield commanders to ministry analysts to Politburo briefing rooms where strategic realities confronted ideological commitments. Reznikov's account joined dozens of similar dispatches from exercises and intelligence assessments throughout the 1980s, forming composite portrait of Western technological advancement that Soviet planning had systematically underestimated through combination of wishful analysis and institutional resistance to uncomfortable conclusions. The metallurgists who had assured military leadership that Soviet armor represented sufficient protection now faced technical evidence of composite materials providing defensive capabilities, generations beyond laminated steel, while fire control specialists confronted targeting systems, integrating thermal imaging and ballistic computers with accuracy their own designs could not match within current development timelines. The turbine engine they had mocked as impractical demonstrated power-to-weight ratios, enabling tactical mobility that transformed armored doctrine, speed becoming defensive capability as significant as thickness, when opponents could maneuver faster than targeting solutions updated. Moscow received these assessments with reactions mixing denial and recalibration. senior officers proposing tactical modifications, while deeper analysts recognized problems requiring industrial and technological infrastructure Soviet economy could not provide without fundamental restructuring. The defense expenditures necessary to achieve parity with Western armor development competed against economic fragilities, increasingly apparent throughout Soviet system, technological gap reflecting broader disparities in manufacturing capability and innovation frameworks. Party officials accustomed to declaring socialist superiority confronted engineering reports demonstrating capitalist research had produced tangible advantages measurable in armor penetration and crew survival. Rates, ideological confidence colliding with empirical demonstration. The Abrams represented more than superior tank design, embodying Western technological momentum that Soviet centralized planning struggled matching despite dedicating disproportionate resources to military development. The crews, who survived encounters with American armor, carried knowledge that permeated through ranks with informal efficiency exceeding official channels, soldiers sharing understanding that comfortable assumptions about Soviet invincibility had been comfortable fictions. Training exercises acquired different character, as realistic assessments of Western capabilities replaced propaganda-inflected evaluations. Tactical doctrine adjusting to acknowledge adversary advantages that previous planning had dismissed. The technological revelation extended beyond armor into broader recognition that Western military development had achieved systematic superiority across multiple domains, each advancement compounding into cumulative advantage. Soviet industry could not overcome through ideological commitment alone. Reznikov's final observation in his report captured truth extending beyond immediate engagement, noting that shells failing to penetrate American armor symbolized larger failure of Soviet system to maintain competitive pace with Western innovation, technological defeat foreshadowing political transformations approaching with historical inevitability, that tactical corrections could not prevent, only delay through recognition arriving too late for strategic adjustment. Could Soviet confidence have survived confrontation with reality, or was ideological certainty always destined to shatter against empirical truth? Subscribe to explore more untold Cold War encounters where technology and doctrine collided.